Hi everyone, I'm Jack the Rambling Raconteur, and I hope that you're doing well. I want to make another library memories video. So I made one of these several months ago where I talked about the first time as a reader that I really remembered being disappointed in a book, where I had read the book, and when I finished it, the book itself did not feel worth the time spent acquiring a copy of it, reading the book itself. It just didn't feel like it rewarded that effort, that energy, that time. And it was just disappointing, and how I'd never really had that experience before as a child, as a reader. And I want a happier memory this time as we sort of start 2025. I want a happier memory in my reading. So I was reflecting on a book that I first encountered about 20 years ago. I think it's just over 20 years ago now. And it's a book that exerted an undue influence on my reading, on my life by extension. And it's a book that totally surprised me. I've never seen anybody really talk about this book, talk about another book by this writer. I've only ever seen 2 copies of the book in my life. And yet it has cast a shadow on my reading, this inordinately long shadow on my reading. And I think we all have books like that. We have books that we read that take us somewhere new. They make us feel like an adult reader for the first time. They take us to this new courtyard, or a new ocean, a new world. They take us to the top of a mountain, and from that mountain we see human culture and thought and literature, and we want to go explore. We want to go find out more about this new world that's been opened up to us. And it might be that this was a book that just landed at the right time in our lives. It's a book that we came across just as we met someone who still is very important to us, or just after we lost someone who is very important to us. It might be a book that we received from someone we really trusted, whose opinion we valued, a mentor, a teacher, a close friend, a partner. And those works, that they stay with us, that they connect with us on some emotional level and embed themselves in our memories, that just become part of who we are as readers and as people. And this book really did that for me, but I couldn't have anticipated when I opened it up where it would take me. I came across it as a freshman in college in my college dorm. We had on the second floor, we had this long library. It was really a study room. The building had been built in the 1930s. It had just been remodeled before I moved in, but the carpeting was still this ancient, awful green carpeting with these little gold diamonds that were so worn in places that they almost looked like they were supposed to be poor, pathetic versions of the French fleur-de-lis. But they were really just gold diamonds that had been rubbed and worn out over decades and decades. The rooms had these in-wall desks that were clearly built, for a typewriter, and these long drawers. Any cords had to come down and around. They were pre-electric anything, there on your desk, except maybe a small lamp. And so the building was old, and it had this library that no one ever read any of the books in. There were some tables in there. There were some nice, comfortable chairs to study in. And so folks would just gather in there and read. And there was a lock on the door, which was a whole other issue that will not be discussed in this video. But the library itself was awful. It was not a library, even like this, where there was plenty of works to just dig into and read. It was basically a collection of discards. It was like works that were dissertations, that were highly specific academic works, in fields that almost no one was majoring in. And so they just sat there. It looked like the types of books you would see in a hotel, or in like a bed and breakfast, where it's like the types of books that are meant to make it look old and feel old and intelligent, but nobody's ever expected to touch any of these. Maybe there's no contents in them. They weren't even particularly nice bindings. This is what the copy looked like. This is not the copy of Prometheans, Ancient and Modern, that was there, but it looked pretty, sad and tattered like this one. And so we're in there supposed to be studying for final exams, and I had a couple of finals that first Friday. I had 2 more the last Friday. I had one in between that was a very, very simple course. So I was in there studying and really just being an obnoxious 18-year-old who was not helping anyone, and probably, frankly, I was trying to flirt and stuff. And I didn't want to be too obnoxious, so I finally decided to quiet down and look at the books in there. And I finally saw this title, Prometheans, Ancient and Modern. I thought maybe that could be interesting. And it's like 10 o'clock at night at this point. So I open it up, and it lists 9 authors. I had heard of 4 of them. And I thought, well, okay, you know, the 4 I'd heard of were the author of the Gospel According to Mark, Nietzsche, D.H. Lawrence, and Theodore Dreiser. I had not read any of them except Mark. And frankly, the first 60, 70 pages that are on the Gospel According to Mark are this wild, like almost like conspiracy theory about who this secret identity of Mark was. And I was like, man, this guy is this Burton Rascoe guy. What is this? But I still wanted to spend time with my friends without being obstreperous. So I just kept reading, and I discovered Petronius. I'd never heard of Petronius. I'd never heard of a book called the Satyricon. And then Lucian. I'd never heard of Lucian. I'd never heard of this skeptic who was, you know, in a sense, mocking the Stoics in marvelous detail. Apuleius. I'd never heard of his Metamorphoses or the Golden Ass. I had heard of Ovid and his Metamorphoses, but I'd never read them. But this was some other work. Aretino, that was a name I wasn't familiar with. As I got to Nietzsche and D.H. Lawrence, okay, I've heard of these guys. I haven't read anything by them, but I've heard of them. And I started to realize that as much as, you know, this book had a strange start with Conspiracy Theory Corner, these other writers, they sounded fascinating. These were people I had never heard of them. I had never encountered them in any sense. This was this was a time when Wikipedia was around, but it wasn't quite as popular as it would be even just 1 or 2 years later, where I could go look up these writers, you know, on my laptop in the moment. And so all I had was this. And so I opened up a notebook and started writing these down, and I thought, you know, Christmas is coming in a couple of weeks. Like, I would love to read some books by these folks that I've never heard of. I thought I was a sophisticated reader. I'll be honest. I thought I was a really sophisticated reader when I went to college. I had read several of Dostoevsky's books. I had read East of Eden and The Grapes of Wrath. You know, I mean, I heavy duty stuff. Homer. I had read Homer. I'd read Herodotus. I really thought like I was a sharp kid. You know, little did I know. But yeah, I'd read Shakespeare, but to encounter writers I had truly never heard of, never come across a reference to, never heard a teacher mention, it really opened me up. It made me feel vulnerable. It made me feel like I had a lot to learn, but it also made me feel excited because none of my friends had ever read or heard of these early writers either. People had heard of D.H. Lawrence, but nobody had read anything by him. A couple of folks maybe had read a little bit of Nietzsche, just like they had read a little bit of Kant, enough to be able to crib some ideas and put them into an essay in college, but that was about it. I don't think anybody had read Theodore Dreiser. And so to find this book, this tattered book, was fascinating. I read huge swath of it that night. I think I was up until 2 just reading from this in that library study room. And then I put it back, but then I went back the next night and I finished reading it over that night. And I immediately sent off an email saying, hey, you know I had talked about wanting a couple different books for Christmas. I want the Satyricon by Petronius. I want the Golden Ass by Apuleius. That one got me in a little trouble. I had to explain it was a donkey. I want the Dialogues of Aretino. I want these books, you know. And, well, what I got was A Farewell to Arms by Ernest Hemingway, To Have and Have Not by Ernest Hemingway, which is a terrible book, and The Garden of Eden by Ernest Hemingway. And so I read those. And then I did get a gift card, so I went and I found a copy of The Satyricon by Petronius. And this is a translation by William Arrowsmith. And I was excited for this. I was really excited to get this book. I didn't realize that novels existed in the 1st and 2nd century of the Common Era. I didn't know that. This was something I was learning. I thought everything was sort of just poetry or philosophy, these long epic works. I didn't realize that anybody was writing a story in prose or even a story that in some ways was realistic and was, giving details of Roman life and Trimalchio's absurd feast. And so I read this book, and this translation is a little clunky, but I read it and I thought this was kind of weird. This was different. Later, I would read The Great Gatsby about a couple of months later, and I would realize, wait a second, there's all of these there's references in here to Petronius, jumping back and rereading Petronius. And this really got me going, and it got me to consider that classical literature was far more expansive, far more interesting, far more earthy than I had realized. It was a little bit like reading the Canterbury Tales in high school and realizing, wait a second, like this is like fascinating and hilarious and also like wildly inappropriate. I'm gonna get in trouble. I'm laughing openly as I'm reading it in class. Like I'm gonna get in trouble if somebody asks me that I'm reading The Miller's Tale and I have to describe why it's so funny. And Petronius felt that way, that it felt transgressive, but also interesting. Like I was getting at something that other people were missing, my friends were missing. So I read this and I thought it was interesting. And over the years, I was able to go and find many of these. I found Lucian in the school library, the actual like university library. And years later, I would find this collection of some of his works. It's pretty good. Penguin has since released an edition. I read Nietzsche, Zarathustra, though honestly my favorite still is I think Beyond Good and Evil. The aphoristic way of his writing I think here is stronger than in Zarathustra. But I read Nietzsche within a couple of years. I read D.H. Lawrence, and Lawrence was someone I really did enjoy. I enjoyed just the energy in Lawrence. His short stories, his novel Women in Love is one of my favorite novels. His poetry is outstanding. Some of his longer stories that are set in different places, interesting places. I really thought D.H. Lawrence was someone who, as reprehensible as he could be personally, I thought he was interesting. And then I finally I read an awful translation of Apuleius, but this translation from P.G. Walsh is quite good. This is a good work. And Apuleius was the one that really got me thinking, like, wait a second, there are these early novels. There are novels before what we think of as the novels that dominate the 19th century, or even going back earlier to the 18th century, and works like Gulliver's Travels or Robinson Crusoe, Tom Jones, like those types of books. There's books that are earlier than that, and of course there was Don Quixote, but there's books even earlier than that, like The Tale of Genji. And so Apuleius really was someone that I was excited to read, and having to wait. This was a book that did not disappoint me. This was one that once I finally found a copy, I was excited and I enjoyed it, and I returned to it. But there is Aretino still, because I never did find a copy of Aretino's dialogues. I finally just ordered a copy online a couple of years ago, and I think this year I'm going to read it, and I'm excited to read it. This sort of just about takes me to the end of the Prometheans, Ancient and Modern, and I'm excited to dig into this 16th century work and see the world that Aretino conjures. I've enjoyed the worlds these other writers have taken me to, and that they've lit up for me, but I'm excited to get to Aretino. I'm thinking of reading Sister Carrie, by Theodore Dreiser, seeing if I enjoy that more than An American Tragedy. And I'd like to get into The Rainbow by D.H. Lawrence. I loved Women in Love. His other novels I haven't enjoyed as much, but Women in Love is just a fantastic work. And I'd like to read The Rainbow and see what this holds. So this might be a guide to my reading in 2025. And perhaps I'll reread A Farewell to Arms as well. But this was a book that did change my reading and opened up a new vista for me. So I'd love to hear if there are works like these for others. What are the works that took you to that new world, that out of nowhere just knocked you over and sent you off on a new trajectory in your reading. So I hope everyone's doing well. Thank you.